He struck his wife during the divorce, and the judge taught him a lesson he would never forget. Before starting the story, comment on where you are watching us from. I hope you enjoy this story. Don't forget to subscribe. The air conditioning in family court courtroom number 14 in the Lincoln Park district hummed with a monotonous sound that echoed off the beige walls. It was Monday, 10 a.m., and the courtroom smelled of old paper and cold coffee. Eleanor Vance sat on one of the wooden benches, hands clasped in her lap, feeling the chill of the room seep into her bones. She wore a simple pearl gray dress, with no jewelry or excessive makeup, an image of discretion and austerity. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, revealing a face where, at 42, the fine lines around her eyes told stories her mouth would never speak aloud. She breathed slowly, a conscious exercise to maintain the calm that threatened to break at any second. Across the center aisle sat him, Richard Sterling, her husband, or rather, her soon-to-be ex-husband, a man who now seemed like a complete stranger. Richard, at 47, looked impeccable, as always. His graying hair, slicked back with gel, shone under the artificial lights of the room. He wore a black Italian suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her own rent, a reminder of the opulence he so loved to show off. The burgundy silk tie and shoes that shone like mirrors completed the picture of a successful and self-assured man. However, what really froze Eleanor's blood was not Richard's presence, which she had already gotten used to in her worst nightmares, but the woman sitting next to him. A young woman of no more than 26, bleach blonde, in a red dress so tight it left little to the imagination. Her sky-high black heels and lips, painted a bright crimson, seemed to scream an anticipated and arrogant victory. But worst of all was her smile, that smirk of superiority that seemed to say she had already won a war Eleanor didn't even know she was fighting. The young woman, Kaylee, leaned toward Richard and whispered something in his ear. He smiled, a small, complicit, intimate smile. The same smile he had once dedicated to Eleanor during their honeymoon in Hawaii, 22 long years ago. A sharp pang shot through Eleanor's chest, but she didn't look away. She had promised herself not to cry, not there, not that day. Beside her, Margaret Fletcher, her lawyer, reviewed some documents with a serious and unperturbed expression. Margaret, 54, with her short silver hair and square-rimmed glasses, had a fearsome reputation in the Chicago courts. She was known for tearing apart unfaithful husbands with the precision of a surgeon, a reputation that had given Eleanor a small glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. "Are you ready?" Margaret whispered, without looking up from the papers, her voice steady as a rock. Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling a lump in her throat that barely allowed her to breathe. "Ready," Margaret repeated, this time looking her directly in the eyes, her gaze conveying unexpected strength. "Remember, do not react. No matter what he says, no matter what he does, keep your composure." "Understood." Eleanor nodded again, clinging to those words as if they were a life preserver. The side door opened with a creak, and everyone in the room stood up. The judge entered. Magistrate Philip Vernon was a 68-year-old man, tall, with a back as straight as a bamboo rod. His black robe flowed slightly as he walked toward the bench, his presence imposing a solemn silence in the room. He had completely white hair and bushy eyebrows that framed dark brown eyes that seemed capable of reading anyone's soul. He sat down, adjusted his reading glasses, and glanced at the file in front of him for a few seconds that felt like an eternity to Eleanor. The silence in the room was absolute, almost suffocating. Finally, he looked up, and his deep, authoritative voice resonated in the space. Case number 843-2025. No-fault divorce between Eleanor Vance and Richard Sterling. Both parties are present, I understand. The judge continued, his tone without emotional nuance. Yes, Your Honor, the lawyers responded in unison. Judge Vernon looked at Richard, then at Kaylee, and his eyes lingered on her for 3 seconds longer than necessary. A furrow of disapproval appeared between his brows, a small gesture that did not go unnoticed by Eleanor. "Who are you, miss?" the judge asked in a cold, cutting tone. Kaylee blinked, visibly disconcerted by the direct attention. Richard cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "She is my companion, Your Honor. A friend." The word friend floated in the air like toxic smoke, loaded with a cynicism that churned Eleanor's stomach. Magistrate Vernon clasped his hands on the desk and leaned slightly forward, his gaze fixed on Richard. "Mr. Sterling, do you consider it appropriate to bring a friend to the divorce hearing with the mother of your children?" The silence that followed was dense and heavy, and for the first time, Eleanor saw a crack in her husband's facade of confidence. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Kaylee, for her part, stopped smiling, and her face went pale under her makeup. Richard's lawyer, a young man in a gray suit named Michael Parker, intervened quickly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my client has the right to be accompanied by whomever he deems convenient." "You are right, Mr. Parker," the judge replied without flinching. "But this court also has the right to point out when a presence is offensive, provocative, and frankly, in poor taste." A murmur ran through the room, and Eleanor had to press her lips together to keep from smiling. Beside her, Margaret remained impassive, but her eyes shone with a spark of satisfaction. Richard turned red, not from shame, but from pure, contained rage. "Your Honor, he began to say, but the judge cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Silence. Let us proceed." He took the file again and turned some pages in silence. The wall clock marked 10:17. Every second that passed seemed to stretch like gum, stretching the tension to the limit. "Good," the judge finally said. "According to the agreement presented by both parties, Mr. Sterling proposes an equitable division of assets, 50% for each. Ms. Vance accepts. Is that correct?" Margaret stood up. "Correct, Your Honor. My client accepts the terms." Michael Parker also stood up. "That is correct, Your Honor. Both parties are in agreement." The judge nodded slowly, as if chewing each word before pronouncing it. "Very well, then we will proceed to the signing of the agreement." A court officer approached with the documents and placed them first in front of Richard. He took the pen with a firm, almost triumphant hand, and before signing, turned to look at Kaylee, who returned a complicit smile. Then, his gaze met Eleanor's. In that instant, his eyes said everything his mouth could not. "You lost. I won. Now I am free." He signed with a wide, sure, and arrogant stroke. The officer took the papers and walked toward Eleanor's table. She felt her heart beating in her ears and took a deep breath. Margaret put a hand on her shoulder, a subtle touch, but enough to remind her, "Trust me." Eleanor took the pen, brought it close to the paper, and just as she was about to sign, Judge Vernon's voice boomed in the room. "Wait." Everyone froze. The magistrate took off his glasses, cleaned them with a white handkerchief, and looked directly at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, I have a question before this continues. During the last 6 months, have you made any unusual bank transfers, purchased properties, or moved money from joint accounts to personal accounts?" The silence that followed was sepulchral. The apartment on Michigan Avenue in the Gold Coast had enormous windows that let in the sunset light, bathing the modern, minimalist space in golden tones. The light wood floors and designer furniture Eleanor had chosen with patience over the years now felt like pieces in an empty museum. Beautiful, but lifeless. Every painting on the walls, every object told a story that now seemed like a painful farce. There was the black and white photograph of Central Park in New York, where Richard had proposed to her, a memory that now burned in her mind. The ceramic vase from Santa Fe they bought on their first anniversary, and the oil painting of the Virgin Mary that her mother gave her when her daughter Victoria was born. Everything seemed to belong to a life that was no longer hers. Eleanor sat on the cream-colored sofa, a cup of chamomile tea in her hands. It was 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and loneliness was her only companion. Richard had left at 6 in the morning, saying he had an important meeting with investors in the Loop and would be back at 7. His cell phone, face down on the coffee table, was a mute witness to his lies. She didn't want to see any more unanswered messages. The silence of the apartment was oppressive. She didn't even play music. Victoria, her 19-year-old daughter, was studying pre-law at Stanford, and Samuel, her 16-year-old son, spent more and more time at his friends' houses, fleeing the heavy atmosphere breathed in their home. Eleanor took a sip of tea, lukewarm, almost cold, and closed her eyes, wondering when it had all begun. She didn't know exactly. Maybe a year ago, or 2, or perhaps the betrayal had always been there, hidden under layers of routine and well-told lies. At first it was small things, details she had deliberately ignored. Richard arriving late from work, normal for the director of a textile import company. Then came the business trips, increasingly frequent. Seattle, Boston, Denver, Dallas. Meetings with suppliers, closing important contracts, excuses Eleanor had accepted without hesitation. Why wouldn't she believe him? He was her husband, the father of her children, the man with whom she had built a life for more than 2 decades. But then came the signs impossible to ignore, like the smell of a perfume that wasn't hers. One day, hugging him when he arrived from a trip, she perceived a sweet floral fragrance with hints of vanilla. She mentioned it, and he laughed, saying some perfume salesgirl at the airport had sprayed him. She accepted the explanation, but the smell returned again and again. Then there was the cell phone, which Richard now carried with him everywhere, as if it were a vital organ. One night while he slept, Eleanor tried to unlock it, just to confirm she was paranoid. But it had a passcode, something he had never used before. The next morning she mentioned it casually. "I saw you put a code on your phone," she said while making coffee. "Yes, for security. I have confidential company information," he replied, without looking up from the newspaper. Weeks passed, and Richard became increasingly distant. He no longer asked how her day had been, didn't kiss her upon arrival, didn't touch her at night. They slept in the same bed, but an abyss of thousands of miles separated them. Eleanor tried to talk to him repeatedly. "Are you okay? Is something wrong?" "I'm fine. It's just a lot of work," was always his evasive answer. The wall between them grew higher with each conversation until the day of truth arrived. It was a Saturday morning, and Richard had left early to play golf. While gathering clothes for the wash, Eleanor picked up the jacket he had worn the day before. Checking it, she felt a folded paper in the inside pocket. It was a receipt from the Signature Room restaurant, dated Thursday, March 14th, for 2 people. Eleanor froze. On Thursday, March 14th, Richard had told her he had a business dinner in Seattle. But the receipt was from Chicago, from one of the most romantic restaurants in the city. She felt short of breath. In another pocket, she found a hotel receipt, the Ritz-Carlton Junior Suite, 2 guests, from Friday, March 15th to Sunday, March 17th. She collapsed onto the bed, hands trembling and heart racing. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. Richard was cheating on her. She cried until she had no more tears left, until her throat hurt. Then she got up, washed her face, and made a decision. She wouldn't tell him anything yet. She needed proof. She needed to be sure, although deep down she already knew. The following days were a silent nightmare. Eleanor acted normally, pretending everything was fine while dying inside. One afternoon, she called her best friend, Teresa Norris, a psychologist specializing in couples therapy. They met at a cafe in Wicker Park, and Eleanor told her everything. The receipts, the trips, the perfume, the coldness, the distance. Teresa listened in silence, and when Eleanor finished, she put her hand over her friend's. "Eleanor, honey, you already know what's happening," she said gently. "I know," Eleanor whispered with a broken voice, "but I don't want to believe it." "I understand, but this can't go on." "You need to confront him," Teresa insisted. "But first, you need to protect yourself legally, financially, and emotionally." "Protect myself from my husband?" Eleanor asked incredulously. "Yes, from your husband. Because if what you suspect is true, he has already made decisions that affect you, and you need to be prepared." And Teresa showed her a contact for a lawyer on her cell phone. "Margaret Fletcher, family law specialist. She is the best. Tough, smart, ruthless. If anyone can help you, it's her." That same afternoon, while Richard was still out, Eleanor dialed the number for Fletcher and Associates. She scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday at 4 in the afternoon. Upon hanging up, she stared at the phone in her hand and, for the first time in weeks, felt something other than pain. She felt rage, a cold and determined rage that began to replace her sadness. Tuesday arrived faster than expected. Eleanor dressed in a beige suit and left the apartment without telling Richard where she was going. The firm, located in a corporate building on LaSalle Street, was elegant and modern. Margaret Fletcher's office was impressive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Behind a massive dark wood desk stood Margaret Fletcher, with her short silver hair, thick-rimmed glasses, and a piercing gaze. She stood up and extended her hand. "Mrs. Vance, welcome. I am Margaret Fletcher. Please, take a seat." Her hand was firm, sure, and for the first time, Eleanor felt she wasn't alone in this. With a trembling voice at first, but increasingly steady, she told her everything. Margaret listened in silence, taking notes, without interrupting or judging. When Eleanor finished, the lawyer put the pen on the table and looked her directly in the eyes. "Mrs. Vance, I'm going to be honest with you. What you describe is a classic pattern of premeditated infidelity. Your husband is not only cheating on you, he is preparing the ground for something bigger." Eleanor felt a chill. "What do you mean?" "I mean, he is likely already moving money, hiding assets, preparing for a divorce on his terms, not yours. Because a man who cheats so brazenly is a man who no longer fears the consequences, and that means he already has a plan. But don't worry. If he's playing dirty, we will play even dirtier. And believe me, Mrs. Vance, we will win." 4 months before the trial, Eleanor walked down the hallway of her apartment like a stranger in her own home. Every step was calculated, every word measured, every gesture rehearsed. Living with Richard had become a play, where she played the role of the naive wife, while he continued to believe his lie was perfect. But inside, Eleanor burned with a silent fury that consumed her slowly. She had been working secretly with Margaret for 2 months. 2 months gathering information. 2 months pretending everything was fine, while her world crumbled piece by piece. It was Friday night. Richard had arrived from work, showered, and was now sitting on the sofa checking his cell phone with a smile that made Eleanor's stomach turn. The image of his happiness elsewhere was constant torture. "Do you want some dinner?" she asked from the kitchen with a sweet voice, a masterful performance of normality. "No thanks. I already ate something at the office," he replied, without looking up, his indifference one more dagger in Eleanor's heart. Lie. She had checked the bank statements that morning. Richard had paid the bill at an Italian restaurant in the West Loop at 2 in the afternoon. 2 main courses, a bottle of wine, dessert for 2. Eleanor said nothing, just smiled and prepared a salad for herself. While she ate, she watched him out of the corner of her eye. Every message he sent was like a stab wound, but she no longer cried or begged for attention. Now she just waited, with icy patience, for the perfect moment to destroy him. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Margaret. "Can you talk?" She got up from the table naturally. "I'm going to the bathroom," she announced, although Richard didn't even respond, absorbed in his phone. Locked in the bathroom, she dialed Margaret's number. "Good evening, Eleanor. Are you alone?" asked the lawyer. "Yes, Richard is in the living room." "What happened?" "I have good news and bad news. The bad news first. The forensic accountant found that Richard has been moving money aggressively in the last 6 months. Transfers to personal accounts, investments in third-party names, cash withdrawals totaling more than $150,000, Margaret continued. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling nauseous. "And the good news?" she asked with a thread of a voice. "That we have records of everything. And better yet, we discovered who he is giving the money to. Her, the mistress. Her name is Kaylee Miller, 26 years old. Richard bought her a condo in the Gold Coast 3 months ago. Value, $950,000 in her name. He used money from the sale of a piece of land you both owned in Lake Geneva, a marital property. He sold it without your authorization and forged your signature." "That is fraud and a felony," Margaret explained, each word a crushing blow. Tears began to roll down Eleanor's cheeks, but this time they weren't from sadness, but from pure rage. "What else do you have?" she asked, her voice charged with new determination. "Travel invoices. Paris, Barcelona, Miami. Always tickets for 2 people, luxury hotels, everything paid with shared credit cards. And a life insurance policy he took out 4 months ago for $2 million. Guess who the sole beneficiary is?" "Kaylee, of course." Eleanor paced in circles in the small bathroom, trying to process the magnitude of the betrayal. "What's next, Margaret?" she asked, her mind racing. "We keep gathering. We can't leave a single loose end. I need you to keep acting normal. Do not confront him. As long as he thinks he's in control, we'll keep building the case. And when we get to court, we are going to crush him." Eleanor looked in the mirror. Her eyes were red, but her expression was different. She was no longer the broken woman from 2 months ago. She was a woman at war. She left the bathroom as if nothing had happened. Richard was still on the sofa, now watching an action movie without paying attention. His cell phone kept lighting up with notifications. "Everything okay?" he asked without looking at her. "Yes, everything okay." Eleanor picked up a book and pretended to read, but her mind was elsewhere, imagining the moment she would see him fall. 3 months before the trial, the weekly meetings with Margaret had become her secret ritual. The lawyer's office was full of folders and documents covering the table. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a sheet with highlighted numbers. "In the last 8 months, Richard transferred $300,000 from joint accounts to a personal account you didn't know existed." Eleanor watched the numbers, feeling how the money they had saved together became the weapon of his own destruction. "And this?" she asked, pointing to some photographs. "That is pure gold," Margaret replied with a satisfied smile. "I hired a private investigator. These are photos of Richard and Kaylee together, in restaurants, in hotels, entering the Gold Coast condo, kissing in Millennium Park." Each image was physical pain, but also fuel for her determination. "How much more proof do you need?" she asked firmly. "We're almost there. Only one important detail is missing. I need Richard to believe that you will accept a no-fault divorce, that you will sign whatever he puts in front of you without fighting. I need him to lower his guard completely." "Why?" inquired Eleanor, confused. "Because if he thinks he won, he will get confident. And when he arrives at court with that confidence, we will ambush him with all the evidence. He won't be able to escape. He won't be able to lie. He will be trapped in front of the judge." The plan was risky, requiring her to swallow her pride and feign weakness, but it was worth it. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, ready for anything. "That when he proposes the divorce, because he will soon, you accept without resistance. Cry if necessary. Act defeated. Tell him you just want it all to end quickly. And then, at the hearing, we present our counteroffensive with all the evidence. The judge will see that he tried to defraud you, and that's where we destroy him legally." 2 months before the trial, it happened. It was a Sunday morning, and Richard walked into the kitchen with a serious expression. "Eleanor, we need to talk." She felt her heart skip a beat. She knew what was coming. "I think we should get a divorce," he said, without looking her in the eyes. Eleanor feigned surprise, put a hand to her chest, and let the tears flow. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice broken by the fake crying. "No, there is no one else. I just think it's better for both of us to move on," he lied. Eleanor remembered Margaret's words, "Act defeated." "And what do you propose?" she asked. "A no-fault divorce, no fights. We split everything 50-50 and each goes their own way. Clean, fast." Eleanor lowered her gaze, pretending to be devastated. "I don't want to fight, Richard. I just want this to end." He seemed relieved, even sketched a small smile. "I'm glad you see it that way. I'll talk to my lawyer to prepare the papers." As soon as the door closed, Eleanor stopped crying and texted Margaret. "He took the bait." The reply came in seconds. "Perfect. Now get ready, because when the day of the trial comes, that man is going to wish he had never met you." 1 month before the trial, everything was in place. Margaret had assembled a file so solid that no judge could ignore it. Eleanor signed preliminary documents, accepting Richard's conditions without complaint. She cried when he packed his things and moved out, supposedly to an apartment in the suburbs, although she knew he had actually gone to the love nest he bought for Kaylee. The hearing date was set for a Monday at 10 a.m. in Family Court Courtroom 14, before Judge Philip Vernon, known for being strict and not tolerating lies. The night before, Eleanor couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from anticipation. She imagined Richard's face seeing the evidence, his arrogance vanishing, his fall, and in the darkness, she smiled. Tomorrow, finally, justice would arrive. The dawn of the trial day found Eleanor awake, with a mixture of anxiety and adrenaline running through her veins. She got up at 5:30 in the morning, watching from the window as the city of Chicago slowly woke up. The sky was tinged with a pale violet, announcing a sunrise that would bring with it the day she had waited for months. A day that promised to be the end of her nightmare and the beginning of a new life. She made herself a black coffee, no sugar, needing the lucidity and concentration the caffeine provided. A message from Margaret on her cell phone, sent at 5 in the morning, reminded her of the plan. "Good morning. Today is the day. Remember, stay calm no matter what happens. See you at 9:30 at the courthouse. Everything will go well." Eleanor replied with a simple, "I'll be there," her determination firmer than ever. In the shower, she let the hot water fall over her body, as if she wanted to wash away all the pain, humiliation, and accumulated rage. Looking in the mirror, she saw a tired face with dark circles, but in her eyes, there was a new light, an unshakable determination. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple pearl gray dress, unadorned, an image of sobriety that would contrast with the ostentation of her adversaries. She gathered her hair in a low ponytail and applied minimal makeup. The only jewelry she wore was her wedding ring, a detail suggested by Margaret to accentuate Richard's cruelty before the judge. At 8:40, she left her apartment and took a cab toward Lincoln Park. During the ride, she mentally reviewed the evidence, the documents, the photographs, every piece of the puzzle Margaret had assembled with meticulousness. The file, of more than 300 pages, was overwhelming testimony of Richard's betrayal. Arriving at the courthouse, a gray and old building, she took a deep breath. It was time. In the lobby, full of people, she found Margaret near the elevators, dressed in an impeccable black suit. "How are you feeling?" the lawyer asked her. "Nervous but ready," Eleanor replied. They went up to the 3rd floor, and in the waiting room, Margaret handed her a summarized copy of the file. "Review it one last time, not to memorize it, but so you remember that we have everything. Every lie of Richard's is documented here." Eleanor glanced through the pages, seeing the highlighted transfers, the photos of Richard with Kaylee, the hotel bills, the contracts with forged signatures. What if he brings a good lawyer? What if he has an excuse for all this? She asked, a shadow of doubt appearing. "There is no possible excuse for this, Eleanor," Margaret replied with a cold smile. "And Judge Vernon is not a man who lets himself be fooled. I have been before him on other occasions. He is tough, but fair, and tolerates no injustice." "Do you think he'll bring Kaylee?" inquired Eleanor. "If he is as arrogant as I think, it's possible. And if he does, that will play completely in our favor. Bringing your mistress to the divorce hearing is a monumental lack of respect, a provocation the judge will not overlook." Eleanor nodded, feeling a little more secure. At 9:45, they headed to the courtroom. A security officer verified their names and let them pass. The room was freezing, the hum of the air conditioning filling the silence. Eleanor sat at the table on the left, her legs trembling slightly, while Margaret organized her documents with precise, almost surgical movements. The door opened again, and Richard's expensive cologne flooded the room. He entered with a confident stride, head held high, a confident smile on his lips, dressed in a black Italian suit that screamed wealth. But what made Eleanor's stomach twist was seeing Kaylee holding his hand, with her tight red dress, plunging neckline, and that smirk of superiority that seemed to mock her pain. Eleanor clenched her fists under the table, breathing deeply, repeating to herself, "Do not react." Richard and Kaylee sat at the table on the right. He whispered something in her ear, and she let out a silly giggle. Margaret didn't even look at them, concentrated on her papers. Richard's lawyer, Michael Parker, arrived shortly after, with a serious and professional expression. The clock struck 9:58. The murmur in the room was constant. Lawyers, onlookers, and law students filled the back benches. Eleanor felt all eyes on her, the betrayed wife, the unfaithful husband, the young mistress. A classic drama, but no one knew the real drama was just beginning. At 10 o'clock sharp, the side door of the bench opened, and Judge Philip Vernon entered. Everyone stood up. With his black robe, white hair, and severe face, he walked to his chair with authoritative steps. He sat down, adjusted his glasses, and took the file. The silence in the room was absolute. "Case number 843-2025, he said, with a deep voice. "No-fault divorce between Eleanor Vance and Richard Sterling." He paused, his eyes scanning the room. They stopped on Eleanor, then on Richard, and finally on Kaylee. His expression didn't change, but something in his gaze hardened. "Both parties are present," he continued. "Yes, Your Honor," replied the lawyers. The judge looked at Kaylee again, this time for longer, causing her to shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Who are you, miss?" Kaylee blinked, disconcerted. "She is my companion, Your Honor, a friend," Richard intervened. The judge let the word friend float in the air. "Mr. Sterling, do you consider it appropriate to bring a friend to the divorce hearing with the mother of your children?" The entire room held its breath. Richard bristled, and Michael Parker stood up quickly to defend his client. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my client has the right to be accompanied." "You are right, Counselor," the judge interrupted him. "But this court also has the right to point out when a presence is offensive, provocative, and frankly, in poor taste." A murmur ran through the benches. Richard turned redder, now with rage. The judge proceeded to read the divorce agreement, the equitable division of assets that both parties supposedly accepted. An officer approached with the documents for the signature. Richard signed with an arrogant stroke, dedicating a triumphant look to Eleanor. When it was her turn, she took the pen. But just before signing, the judge's voice resonated like thunder. "Wait." The magistrate slowly took off his glasses and looked at Richard with an intensity that cut the air. "Mr. Sterling, I have a question before this continues. During the last 6 months, have you made any unusual bank transfers? Have you purchased properties? Have you moved money from joint accounts to personal accounts?" The silence that followed was sepulchral. In that moment, Eleanor knew the trap had just snapped shut. Richard's face transformed in a second. The security and arrogance he had shown upon entering evaporated like water in the desert. His eyes darted rapidly from side to side, looking for an exit that didn't exist. His jaw tensed, and the veins in his neck stood out under his skin. I don't understand the question, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Judge Vernon clasped his hands on the desk, his calm a demonstration of absolute power. "It is a very simple question, Mr. Sterling. Have you moved assets without your wife's knowledge during the divorce process? Yes or no?" Michael Parker jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That has no relevance in a no-fault divorce where both parties have already agreed on the terms." Margaret stood up with the elegance of a panther stalking its prey, her voice firm and sharp as a razor. "It has all the relevance in the world, Your Honor. If Mr. Sterling hid assets during the process, the agreement is completely void, and if he lied under oath, we are talking about perjury, a serious felony." "That is ridiculous," shouted Richard, losing all composure. "I don't have to answer this." The judge's gavel struck the table with a dry, definitive sound that made everyone in the room jump. "Order!" boomed the magistrate's voice. The silence that followed was so deep, one could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "Mr. Sterling," said the judge with an icy voice, "I remind you that you are under oath. Lying before this court constitutes a criminal offense. So I will ask the question one more time, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Have you moved assets without your wife's consent during the divorce process? Richard swallowed hard, his hands trembling on the table. He turned to look at his lawyer, seeking help, but Michael Parker had the expression of a man who has just seen the iceberg that will sink his ship. Kaylee, beside him, had stopped smiling completely, her face pale and her hands clutching her designer bag as if it were a life preserver. I have the right to manage my money as—" he tried to defend himself. "Answer yes or no, Mr. Sterling," insisted the judge. "No," shouted Richard, his voice cracking slightly. "I haven't done anything illegal." The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on Richard, the look of a predator who knows his prey is cornered. "I see." Margaret smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but Eleanor saw it and knew that what came next would be devastating. The lawyer pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase, so full of documents it barely stayed closed. She placed it on the table with a soft but forceful thud that resonated in the silence of the room. "Your Honor, I would like to present evidence that completely contradicts Mr. Sterling's statement." Richard's face went from red to white in an instant. "Your Honor, we were not notified of any additional evidence," protested Michael Parker, "because Mr. Sterling stated under oath that he accepted a no-fault divorce. However, when one of the parties has committed asset fraud, the case changes nature," replied Margaret. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead, Ms. Fletcher. Present your evidence." Margaret opened the folder and began to take out documents, bank statements, invoices, contracts, photographs. She placed them on her table in perfect order, like a poker player who knows she has the best hand. She walked slowly toward the center of the room, all eyes on her. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice filling every corner of the space, "performed a total of 17 unauthorized transfers in the last 8 months, from joint accounts to a personal account he opened a year ago without my client's knowledge." She showed the first document to the judge. "Total amount of transfers, $300,000. "That is a lie," shouted Richard, jumping to his feet. "Sit down," ordered the judge with a sharp voice. Richard slumped back into his chair. Margaret continued, unperturbed. "Furthermore, Mr. Sterling bought a condo in the Gold Coast in the name of Miss Kaylee Miller," she said, pointing to Kaylee with a devastating gesture. "Purchase price, $950,000. Kaylee sank into her seat, her face as red as her dress, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Money coming from the sale of a land plot in Lake Geneva that was marital property, sold without my client's authorization, with a forged signature," continued Margaret, placing the sales contract on the judge's table. "As you can see, Your Honor, the signature does not match. I have here a handwriting analysis that confirms it." "Your Honor, we need time to review," stammered Michael Parker. "There is no time," cut the judge. "Continue, Ms. Fletcher." Margaret took out more documents. "I also have invoices for 3 international trips taken by Mr. Sterling and Miss Miller. Paris, Barcelona, Miami. Business class plane tickets, 5-star hotels, luxury restaurants, all paid with shared credit cards." She placed the invoices on the table, one by one. "And here we have something particularly interesting. A life insurance policy taken out by Mr. Sterling 4 months ago, value $2 million, paid with money from the marital estate." She paused dramatically. "Guess who the sole beneficiary is, Your Honor?" "Miss Kaylee Miller." The murmur in the room erupted. Kaylee began to cry openly, covering her face with her hands. Richard had a lost look, his face ash gray, like a man who has just seen his own open grave. Judge Vernon reviewed each document with an inscrutable expression, every second of his silence increasing the tension. Finally, he looked up at Richard. "Mr. Sterling, Do you have anything to say in your defense? Richard opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water, unable to articulate a word. I can explain it. I am not interested in your explanation. The judge interrupted him with a coldness that froze the blood. I am interested in the truth, and here is documented proof of asset fraud, embezzlement of funds, concealment of assets, and forgery of signature. Your Honor, I request a recess, tried Michael Parker. Denied, struck the judge's gavel. This court does not tolerate deceit or manipulation. He took off his glasses and looked at Richard with implacable hardness. Mr. Sterling, the no-fault divorce agreement is annulled. This case becomes a fault-based divorce due to your conduct, with serious grounds: adultery, dissipation of assets, fraud, and forgery of documents. I order the immediate freezing of all your bank accounts, a complete asset investigation, an audit of your company, and financial compensation in favor of Mrs. Vance. Richard went as white as the paper. Kaylee let out a choked scream. Eleanor, for the first time in months, felt she could breathe. Tears ran down her cheeks, but this time, they were of liberation. At that moment, when justice seemed to have dictated its initial verdict, Richard completely lost his mind. He rose from his chair with excessive violence, knocking it backward with a crash that echoed throughout the room. His eyes were bloodshot, the veins in his neck marked like tense ropes about to snap, his face a mask of animal fury. "This is a trap!" he shouted with a ragged voice, his accusation resonating off the courtroom walls. "You set a trap for me, you bitch!" He walked toward Eleanor with heavy, fast, and furious steps, his hands turned into fists, his body trembling with uncontrollable rage. The air charged with palpable tension, the prelude to imminent violence. Margaret interposed immediately, standing between him and Eleanor, a human shield against Richard's fury. "Mr. Sterling, stop!" she ordered with a firm voice, but Richard, blind with rage, shoved her aside with such force that the lawyer stumbled and almost fell. Chaos broke out in the room, the murmurs of those present turning into shouts of astonishment and fear. And then, in front of the judge, in front of the lawyers, in front of everyone present, Richard Sterling raised his hand and slapped Eleanor with all the strength he had. The sound of the blow resonated in the room like a gunshot, a dry and brutal sound that silenced everything else. The violence of the act left everyone petrified, witnesses to an aggression as flagrant as it was unexpected. Eleanor fell from her chair, bringing a hand to her face, the impact leaving her stunned. She felt the metallic taste of blood in her mouth, her lips split by the force of the blow. The pain was intense, but worse was the humiliation of being hit in public, in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary of law and order. Kaylee screamed, a sharp and terrified sound. The security guards ran toward Richard from the side doors, their reaction delayed by the speed of events. Margaret knelt beside Eleanor, holding her, her face a mixture of concern and fury. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" she asked, her voice an anchor amidst the chaos. Eleanor nodded, although the world was spinning around her. Judge Philip Vernon, with a face of contained fury that no one in that room had ever seen, stood up. He struck the gavel 3 times, 3 dry, violent, definitive blows that resonated like death sentences. "Order! Order! Order!" His voice was thunder making the walls tremble. "Seize that man immediately!" The guards grabbed Richard by both arms. He struggled like a caged animal, shouting incoherencies, insulting Eleanor, cursing the judge, spitting venom with every word. "Let me go! That woman ruined me! She ruined me!" he screamed, his desperation turning into violent madness. Magistrate Vernon stepped down from the bench with a firm stride and planted himself in front of Richard, looking him directly in the eyes with absolute contempt. "Mr. Richard Sterling," his voice was low, but every word was a hammer. "You are under arrest for physical assault in a judicial hearing, contempt of court, domestic violence, and making threats. You will be transferred immediately to the district attorney's office, where you will face criminal charges in addition to the civil ones," the judge continued, his sentence unappealable. He turned to the guards. "Handcuff him and remove him from my courtroom. Now." The guards took out handcuffs, and despite Richard's resistance, in seconds he was immobilized, hands tied behind his back. "You can't do this! I'm innocent!" he shouted, his denial pathetic against the evidence of his actions. "Innocent," repeated the judge bitterly. "You just hit your wife in front of a magistrate. If that is innocence, I don't want to know what guilt is." He made a gesture with his hand. "Take him out." Richard was dragged toward the back door, screaming, cursing, his voice fading as they took him down the hallway. Kaylee, sobbing inconsolably, tried to follow him. "Richard, wait!" she shouted, stumbling on her heels. An officer blocked her path. "Miss, you cannot go out that way. Sit down, or you will also be removed from the room." Kaylee stopped, trembling, mascara running down her cheeks, her red dress now a cruel mockery. She turned toward Eleanor with a mixture of fear, hate, and despair, but Eleanor wasn't looking at her. Her eyes were closed, breathing slowly, with Margaret's hand on her shoulder and a handkerchief pressed against her bleeding lip. Judge Vernon returned to the bench, adjusted his robe, and took a deep breath to regain composure. "This hearing is suspended," he announced. "A new date will be scheduled to continue the process once Mr. Sterling faces the corresponding criminal charges. Mrs. Vance, you have my full support. This court will see justice done." He struck the gavel one last time. "Court is adjourned." And with that, it was all over. The silence that followed was strange, charged with tension and astonishment. Margaret helped Eleanor to her feet. "You need medical attention," she told her, examining the wound. "The cut isn't deep, but we need to document this." A paramedic entered the room and cleaned Eleanor's wound, giving her an ice pack. Meanwhile, Margaret explained the implications of what had just happened. "This changes everything, Eleanor. Richard didn't just commit fraud. Now he also committed a serious felony. There is no way he escapes this." When Michael Parker approached Margaret's table, defeated. "Ms. Fletcher, I need to speak with you." "The next steps are simple, Mr. Parker." Margaret cut him off coldly. "Your client will face criminal charges, and my client will receive what legally corresponds to her. There is nothing else to discuss." He nodded and left the room. Kaylee finally stood up and walked toward the exit, unsure. Before leaving, she turned to look at Eleanor one last time. There was nothing left of her arrogance, only fear. Eleanor looked her directly in the eyes and felt no hate, only pity for a young woman who had sold her dignity for a condo and some trips, building her own prison. When they were finally alone, Margaret asked Eleanor how she felt. She took a deep breath, removed the ice pack from her lip, and looked at her lawyer. "I feel free," she said, and for the first time in 22 years, she meant it. The king's fall had been total, and in his ruins, Eleanor began to glimpse her own rebirth. They left the courthouse together, the midday sun beating down strong over Chicago. Life on the streets continued, indifferent to the personal battles fought in the courts. Margaret accompanied Eleanor to a cab. "Rest today. See me tomorrow at my office to plan the next steps." "The worst is over," she told her, her voice a mix of professionalism and genuine concern. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything," Eleanor replied, her gratitude immense. Don't thank me. You did this. I only gave you the tools. You were the one who had the courage to use them." Eleanor got into the cab, and during the ride to her apartment in the Gold Coast, her mind replayed the day's events over and over. Richard's face seeing the evidence, the judge's voice, the slap, the arrest. It all seemed unreal, a nightmare from which she was finally waking up. Arriving at her building, she entered her apartment and closed the door. The silence that received her was different, no longer oppressive, but full of peace. She took off her shoes and collapsed onto the sofa. Her cell phone vibrated. It was a message from her daughter, Victoria. "Mom, how did it go? Teresa told me. Call me when you can." Eleanor smiled and dialed her number. "Mom, are you okay?" asked Victoria upon answering. "Yes, my love, I'm fine," Eleanor replied, although her voice trembled. She told her what had happened, her father's aggression. "What? Are you hurt? I'm coming there," exclaimed Victoria, between shock and rage. "No, my love, it's not necessary. I'm fine. The important thing is that he is detained and is going to pay for everything he did." After talking to her daughter, Eleanor sat in silence, assimilating the new reality. For the first time in years, she felt hope. That night she slept deeply, without nightmares, only peace. The next day, she woke up with a swollen lip and a bruise on her cheek, but feeling stronger than ever. She had messages of support from Teresa and her son Samuel. At 3 in the afternoon, she met with Margaret in her office. "I have news," the lawyer told her. "Richard was arraigned this morning before a criminal judge. He was formally charged with assault, domestic violence, fraud, and forgery of documents. The judge ordered pre-trial detention. He will not be released on bail." Eleanor felt a chill. "How long will he be in prison?" "At least 2 to 3 years, possibly more. Additionally," Margaret continued, "the audit of Richard's assets revealed more hidden accounts. The wealth he tried to hide totals more than $4 million. We are requesting 70% of the total assets for you, plus compensation for moral damages. You are going to come out of this not only free, but in a secure financial position to rebuild your life." Eleanor felt the tears return, but this time, they were of gratitude. The following months were a roller coaster of legal procedures and personal reconstruction. Eleanor found herself navigating a world of criminal courts, restitution hearings, and accounting appraisals. With every step, she felt stronger. 4 months later, in April, spring arrived in the city, painting the streets with greenery, a symbol of her new life. She met with Teresa at a cafe in Wicker Park. "You look different," her friend told her. "Lighter." "Because a weight was lifted off me," Eleanor replied with a smile. She told her the latest news. Last week was the final divorce hearing. The judge dictated the final sentence, 70% of the assets for me, 30% for Richard, and compensation of $150,000 for pain and suffering. Furthermore, I kept the Gold Coast apartment, she continued. Richard had to sell his luxury car, and his company is under fiscal investigation. But the best part is that the condo he bought for Kaylee was seized. Since it was acquired with money from the marital estate, it now belongs to me. She had to move out 2 weeks ago. Teresa put a hand to her mouth, incredulous. "And Richard?" she asked. "He is still in the Cook County Jail. The criminal trial is ongoing, but he will likely spend 2.5 years in prison. That man destroyed his own life," Teresa reflected. "You know what the strangest thing is?" said Eleanor. "I don't feel hate, nor a desire for revenge. I just feel relief, as if I could finally breathe after being underwater for years." 1 week later, Eleanor received an unexpected call. It was from the Cook County Jail. Inmate Richard Sterling requests to see you, an officer informed her. Eleanor froze. Why did he want to see her after all the damage he had done? She called Margaret, who warned her it could be an attempt at manipulation. I think I need to see him one last time to close that door permanently, Eleanor decided. 3 days later, accompanied by Margaret, she entered the jail. The place was gray and oppressive. In the visitation area, through thick glass, she saw Richard. He was gaunt, in a prison uniform, unshaven beard, and dull eyes. Nothing remained of the arrogant man he had been. "Thank you for coming," he said through the phone, his voice broken. "I wanted to apologize for everything." "Do you think an apology erases everything you did?" retorted Eleanor, her rage bubbling up. "No, I know it is unforgivable," he admitted, with tears in his eyes. "I needed you to know that I regret it, that I ruined everything, that I lost the best woman I have ever known for something empty. Kaylee left me a week after I was arrested," he confessed. "And what did you expect? Loyalty from someone who built a relationship on betrayal?" snapped Eleanor. "I was an idiot," he said. "I came because I needed to see you like this," Eleanor told him, standing up. "I needed to see that actions have consequences. Goodbye, Richard." She hung up the phone and walked toward the exit without looking back. Upon leaving the jail, she breathed the fresh afternoon air. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked her. Eleanor looked at the sky, the clouds moving slowly. "Free," she finally replied. "Completely free." And for the first time in years, she meant it. The consequences had caught up with Richard, and in his fall, Eleanor had found her liberation. 6 months after the visit to the jail, Eleanor's life had changed completely. It was October, and autumn painted the city in warm tones. She woke up early. Not from anxiety, but from a new habit of rising with the sun. Sitting on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city wake up, she felt everything seemed brighter, full of possibilities. She received a message from Victoria. "Good morning, Mom. Ready for the big day?" Today was the grand opening of New Beginnings, a pottery studio in Hyde Park that Eleanor had opened with the money from the divorce settlement. She didn't want to live on the bitter memory of the past, but to build something new, something completely hers. The storefront, on a beautiful street, was full of light and promise. She had dedicated the last 4 months to remodeling the space and preparing for this day. She looked in the mirror and saw a different woman, with more gray hair and wrinkles, but with a light in her eyes that wasn't there before. Arriving at the studio, she felt a lump in her throat. Her dream made reality. The terracotta-colored facade, the hand-painted logo, everything was perfect. The smell of wood, clay, and fresh paint welcomed her upon entering. The New Beginnings studio quickly filled with friends, neighbors, and family. Teresa arrived with a box of pastries and coffee, her energy contagious. Margaret, dressed casually for the first time since Eleanor had known her, brought a huge floral arrangement. "I am very proud of you," Eleanor told her with a genuine smile. Victoria and Samuel arrived with shining eyes, marveled by the transformation of the shop and their mother. At noon, with the studio full of voices and laughter, Eleanor gave a small speech. With trembling hands, but a steady voice, she thanked everyone for their presence. "This studio is more than a business to me. It is a symbol of transformation. For many years I felt my life was broken, like a vase fallen to the floor. But I learned that broken things can be rebuilt, can become something new, stronger, more beautiful. That is the spirit of New Beginnings," she continued. "A space where we can all take the clay of our lives, mold it anew, and create something beautiful." Thank you for being part of this fresh start." Applause filled the room, and some people, moved by her words, had tears in their eyes. The afternoon passed between impromptu workshops, laughter, and the therapeutic magic of working with clay. When the sun began to set, and the guests left, only Teresa, Margaret, Victoria, Samuel, and Eleanor remained. Sitting on the back patio, sharing what was left of the coffee and pastries, they toasted to the success of the studio and Eleanor's rebirth. "I am so proud of you, Mom," said Victoria, "and I'm glad to see you happy." "I haven't seen you like this in a long time," added Samuel. Closing the shop that night, Eleanor stayed alone for a few minutes, walking through the space, touching the tables, the tools, the walls. This was her place, her creation, her new beginning. She went out to the street and walked aimlessly through Hyde Park, enjoying the night, being alive, being at peace. She entered a small church and in the dim light gave thanks for the strength to move forward and for this second chance. Back at her apartment, she received a message from an unknown number. It was Kaylee. "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I needed to tell you I'm very sorry for what happened. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I also paid the consequences of my actions. I lost the condo, my job, my dignity. I hope you are well." Eleanor read the message and, after a brief reflection, replied, "I received your message. I don't forgive you, but I don't hold a grudge either. We both learned difficult lessons. Be well." Then, she blocked the number, closing that door forever. In the following months, new beginnings gained popularity in the neighborhood. Eleanor hired 2 assistants, Paige, a young ceramist, and Mr. Raymond, an artisan. Together, they created a space of community and healing. Eleanor began to give special workshops for women going through divorce or leaving toxic relationships, partnering with organizations supporting victims of domestic violence. Seeing those women arrive broken and leave with a piece of pottery created by their own hands, eyes shining with pride, was the greatest reward for Eleanor. 1 year after the opening, a woman named Alice arrived at the studio, with sad eyes and a fading bruise on her arm. "A friend told me I could find peace here," she told Eleanor. Eleanor recognized in her the same look she had seen in her own mirror a year ago. "Then you are in the right place," she told her warmly. They spent the next 2 hours working together. At first, Alice was tense and frustrated, but little by little, she began to relax. When she finally managed to create a small bowl, imperfect but beautiful, her eyes filled with tears. "I did it," she whispered. "Yes, you did," replied Eleanor. "And this is just the beginning." That night, while closing the studio, she received an email from the court. Richard would be released in 3 months on parole. Eleanor waited to feel fear or rage, but she felt nothing, only indifference. Richard no longer had power over her. She deleted the email and went out into the night of Hyde Park. The stars shone in the sky, reminding her that even in the deepest darkness, there is always light. She had survived the storm. She had rebuilt her life. She had been reborn. And now, finally, she was ready to live. Not as someone's wife, not as the victim of a betrayal, but as Eleanor Vance, a free, strong, and complete woman. A woman who had learned that broken things can become art, who had taken the clay of her shattered life and molded something beautiful. Justice does not always arrive when we want, but when it arrives complete. Richard Sterling lost his freedom, his money, his reputation, and his family due to his own decisions. Eleanor Vance, on the other hand, lost a marriage, but won something much more valuable. She found herself. This is a story about consequences, about courage, and above all, about rebirth. Because no matter how broken your life is, you can always rebuild it. And sometimes, what we thought was the end is just the beginning of something much better. As she walked under the stars of Chicago, Eleanor smiled, because she knew this wasn't the end of her story, but the beginning of a life she herself had chosen. A life full of possibilities, dreams, peace, a life where the past no longer defined her, where she was the author of her own destiny. And that life, finally, was beautiful. Eleanor had found happiness in her own hands, in the clay she molded every day, in the smiles of the women she helped heal. Her rebirth was complete. The studio became a beacon of hope for many people, a place where stories of pain were transformed into works of art. Eleanor found a purpose beyond her own survival, that of guiding others on their path to healing. Her story became a testimony of resilience, inspiring those who heard it not to give up, to fight for their own freedom and happiness. The echo of justice had resonated, not only in Richard's sentence, but in the new life Eleanor had built for herself. A life of peace, creativity, and service to others. A life that demonstrated that after the storm, the sun always comes out, and that ashes can be the canvas for the most beautiful of works of art. Eleanor often thought about the contrast between her current life and the one she had left behind. The empty opulence of her marriage to Richard had been replaced by the genuine richness of human connections, the satisfaction of creating with her own hands, and the peace of knowing she was the master of her own destiny. Freedom, she discovered, was not in the absence of problems, but in the ability to face them with courage and turn them into opportunities for growth. Her relationship with her children also flourished in this new chapter. Victoria, inspired by her mother's strength and Margaret's brilliance, decided to specialize in family law, with the dream of helping other women find justice. Samuel, for his part, found refuge and a passion in the pottery studio, spending hours at the wheel, discovering his own creative talent. Eleanor's happy ending was not a fairy tale, but a reality forged with tears, courage, and unshakable determination. It was a surprising ending, not because of an unexpected plot twist, but because of the profound transformation of its protagonist, who went from being a silent victim to a heroine of her own story. A woman who not only survived, but was reborn, stronger and more beautiful than ever. The news of Richard's imminent release reached Eleanor in a moment of fulfillment, when her life had found a new and solid center. The indifference she felt upon reading the email from the court was not a mask to hide fear, but the definitive proof of her healing. The man who had once defined her world was now just a distant echo, a discordant note in a symphony she herself had composed, and that now sounded harmonious and full of peace. Eleanor consciously decided not to give him any more space in her mind or her heart. Instead of worrying about his return, she focused on the present and the future of new beginnings. The studio was prospering, and with it, her own sense of purpose. The stories of the women who came to her workshops, each with her own scars, intertwined with hers, creating a network of support and sisterhood that was stronger than any adversity. One day, while organizing an exhibition with the best pieces created in the healing workshops, she received an unexpected visit. Margaret Fletcher entered the studio, not in her usual lawyer's suit, but in comfortable clothes and a relaxed smile. She came not as her legal representative, but as a friend, a confidant, who had been a witness, an architect of her transformation. Eleanor, "This is wonderful," said Margaret, admiring the vases, sculptures, and plates that adorned the studio walls. "Each of these pieces tells a story of resilience. What you have created here goes beyond a business. It is a sanctuary." They sat on the back patio, drinking jasmine tea, and talked for hours, not of laws or trials, but of life, dreams, and new beginnings. Margaret confessed that Eleanor's case had changed her too. After so many years seeing the worst of human nature in courts, your case reminded me why I chose this profession. It reminded me that justice, although sometimes late, can be a powerful agent of change and healing. You inspired me, Eleanor, to keep fighting for women like you. That conversation solidified a bond that went beyond the lawyer-client relationship. They were two strong women, each in her own way, who had found in the other a reflection of their own strength. Together, they began to plan the creation of a foundation that would offer not only free legal advice, but also therapeutic support and empowerment workshops for women, victims of violence. The day Richard got out of prison, Eleanor was in her studio, hands covered in clay, teaching a group of women to center their pieces on the wheel. She didn't think of him for a second. Her world was that: the sound of laughter, the smell of wet earth, the concentration on the art of creating. Justice for her had not been just the condemnation of her aggressor, but the construction of a life so full that her past could no longer overshadow it. However, destiny had prepared one last and surprising turn. A few weeks after his release, Richard, a visibly changed man, aged and humbled by his time in prison, appeared at the studio door. He didn't come to threaten or beg. He came to deliver an envelope. "You don't have to open it now," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "I just wanted you to have it." Eleanor, without saying a word, took the envelope and closed the door. For a moment, she hesitated to open it, fearing it was an attempt at manipulation. But her curiosity and a strange feeling that the cycle had not yet closed completely compelled her to do so. Inside, she found a handwritten letter and a notarized document. In the letter, Richard, with clumsy handwriting stained with tears, asked for forgiveness once more. But this time, his words sounded different. They were not the pleas of a cornered man, but the reflection of someone who had had time to face his demons. "Time in prison made me see the magnitude of the damage I caused, not only to you, but to our children and myself," he wrote. "I know no apology can repair the past, but I want to try to amend a small part. You deserve all the happiness in the world, Eleanor, and I stole many years of it from you." The notarized document was the transfer of his remaining 30% of the marital assets to the foundation Eleanor and Margaret were creating. "It is the only good thing I can do with what I have left," the letter concluded. "I hope it helps other women find the strength you found." Eleanor sat in silence, with the letter in her hand, assimilating this last act of a man who finally seemed to have understood the depth of his error. She didn't forgive him in that moment. Perhaps she never would completely. But she felt one last chain breaking. Justice had not only been punitive, but in an unexpected way, it had also been restorative. Richard's gesture, though late, was the final proof of her victory. Not because she needed his money, but because it demonstrated that her struggle had not been in vain. She had changed the course of her own life, that of her children, and even, in a twisted way, that of the man who had tried to destroy her. The echo of justice had resonated to the last corner of their lives, closing the cycle of pain and opening a future of infinite possibilities. Months later, at the inauguration of the Renaissance Foundation, Eleanor told this last part of her story, not to praise Richard, but to show that transformation is possible. Even in the darkest circumstances, her speech was a song to hope, to resilience, and to the power of forgiveness, not as a gift to the offender, but as an act of liberation for oneself. Victoria, now a young lawyer working at the foundation, and Samuel, a talented artist whose pieces were exhibited in the studio, watched her from the front row with a pride that lit up their faces. Eleanor, surrounded by the women she had helped, her friends, and her children, raised her glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice clear and firm. "To justice that heals, and to the power of being reborn, again and again." Eleanor's happy ending was not the absence of scars, but the beauty she found in transforming them into art. Her story became legend in the courthouse corridors and pottery workshops, a reminder that a woman who decides to fight for herself is an unstoppable force, capable of molding not only clay, but also her own luminous destiny. And so, in the heart of Hyde Park, in a studio full of light and hope, Eleanor Vance continued her work, not as a woman who had survived a tragedy, but as an artist who had discovered the secret of life, that even from the most broken fragments, the most beautiful of masterpieces can be created. The echo of justice would resonate forever, not in the punishment of a man, but in the laughter and creativity of the countless women who, thanks to her, learned to be reborn.